Hi, I'm Jordan.
And I'm Doyle, and I've got some things to say tonight. The topic I want to bring up is no-knock warrants. And there's some things I wanted to kind of share, sort of to spark some of the discussion tonight. Um, the no-knock warrants were not even heard of, and there's been knock and announce court cases in place in English common law since 1604. Was not aware of that. And then in the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1958 in Miller versus the United States that police must give notice before making a forced entry. And that's even been codified in the U.S. federal criminal law in 18 U.S.C. subsection 3109. And that sounds pretty cut and dry to me. But there were a couple of court cases a little more recent than these, the English common law and the U.S. Supreme Court in Wilson versus Arkansas in 1995. The court created an exception to prevent the destruction of evidence. And in Hudson versus Michigan in 2006, the court, by a 5-4 vote, very close, held the exclusionary rule does not require the suppression of evidence police seize during an illegal forced entry, which kind of seems a little odd to me. If it's an illegal forced entry, they can still use the evidence. I'm not a law expert by any means, but the fruit of the poisonous tree seems to be applicable here.
Well, not
Um,
only that, if it's if it's an illegal search area, then by law, not just precedent, but by law, things there don't exist, whether they're legal or not legal, right? Because
True.
that's private area, and so private
Right.
area has no public knowledge, so it can't exist by law.
So we see some things here that just seem very um, wrong and inappropriate. But even beyond that, let's look at what has transpired. In 1981, there were 3,000 no-knock raids in the United States. 3,000, right? That sounded like a tremendous number. In 2005, that number had gone up to 50,000. And these are according to a criminologist, Peter Kraska at Eastern Kentucky University. There have been raids that have led to innocent deaths or deaths of innocent people. In the early 1980s, 40 bystanders, not even the target, had been
Wow.
killed. This is according to the Cato Institute. And here's something that's very unsettling. In the state of Utah, no knock warrants make up about 40% of all warrants issued.
40%?
Yep, yep. And in Maryland, 90% of SWAT deployments were to serve search warrants, with two-thirds through forced entry. So you're looking at what, two-thirds of 90%. So you're looking at 60. 60% of all SWAT deployments were basically no-knock forced entry warrants. Something about that just doesn't smell good. Doesn't
Right.
doesn't feel right, right? I mean, that sort of flies in the face of a lot of our understood constitutional protections. So,
Sure.
what's your take on that? And is there anything present day that I think is relevant? You might think is relevant.
Yeah, well, certainly there's a couple pretty high profile recent cases that involve no knock warrants that I think we probably want to get into and kind of flesh out a little bit. But one thing that I want to highlight here that was kind of, you mentioned, and you mentioned it in the very legal sense of the reasoning for no knock warrants is to prevent the destruction of evidence. So let's think about this for a little bit and try to understand what that means, because the idea is that if there's a knock and announce warrant, that the perpetrator of whatever crime the warrant is for will be trying to, in that period of time between the knock and announce and the opening the door or whatever, will try to destroy evidence. So let's think about the things that could be in someone's possession that might be worthy or cause a warrant to be obtained
Mhm.
for execution at that residence. So they could have kidnapped someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could have illegal goods. They could have, stolen things, right? They could have other kinds of illegal goods of different classes that are, more spoken about in law, like guns, right? They could have illegal guns. So not just stolen, but, they just legally can't have them for some reason or another, depending on the jurisdiction. They could have another type of legal good that is specially called out in law, drugs, right? Things that are, on the DA drug schedule, or was it the FDA or IDA? Whatever three-letter acronym organization keeps the drug schedule.
DEA is Drug Enforcement Agency, so probably the DEA.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. And so it's one of those things. Are there any others that you can think of that I didn't list there?
Well, you stolen goods, people, drugs, things of that sort. I mean, really, that covers about all of it. When you're talking about something that's within someone's physical control.
Right,
Right.
It would have to be inside to destroy it. Right, so it has to be smaller than let's just say a very large house, even.
Right.
Right. So let's take those one by one. If it's a person, you may be able to execute a person before they come into that presence, but can you dispose of that person's corporeal presence before the police, after 30 minutes or whatever they give you to open the door, come storming in, because they can do that by law at that point.
Not through known methods today, I wouldn't think. But
well, yeah, I mean, yeah,
in science fiction kinds of things, but
right, zap laser or whatever.
Right.
So probably not that. It is the intention of these no-knock warrants. Let's talk about a gun. You could potentially disassemble it really fast if you're good at that, and you could drop all of the pieces into some acid, but then they would see gun parts in acid when they came in. So like it's almost unlikely that you'd be able to, unless it was like a 3D printed gun or something. Then there's a whole other host of things that you'd want to talk about aside from that. So I don't think 3D printed guns is what we're talking about here. And if somebody wants to make a case for that, I'm willing to hear that case and let's talk about it. But I don't think that that's it. So, and it's probably not normal guns either, because it's unlikely that they would be taken care of in dispatched in such a short period of time. Let's talk about other goods. I don't think people are worried about, busting into a house because somebody stole a TV that they may destroy to prove that they didn't steal a TV, right? And if so, again, I let's have that conversation, and then we can chastise those law enforcement and those courts for having such a small mental capacity that they think that that's a reasonable course of action in such a scenario. So then we come to drugs, right?
Well, there's one more that you and I both should be a little bit embarrassed that we didn't think about. Digital goods of sorts.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now, pirated movies or other, DRM, digital right, protected or copyright protected digital assets of sorts.
Sure. So that could easily be destroyed between the time. Sure. So maybe we should talk about that, right? Because that could be a case where that there could have that level of criticality. So let's set that aside, though. That's actually interesting that you bring that up, because I do want to talk about that one, because I've never even thought about that as a case, and I think that that's an interesting point. So let's set that aside, but let's talk about drugs. It's pretty clear that was the intention of this change in law. You go look at the cases that spurred it; those were drug cases, clearly. And so the whole idea here is that they got a whole bunch of cocaine or whatever, and then they're gonna if they don't immediately bust down the door, take them by surprise, and grab the contraband, they're just gonna dump it down the toilet, flush the toilet, and hey, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you mean, right? Okay, so that's fine. It's drugs. So then we need to say that if that's the case we care about, why do we care about this? That they may be able to completely eliminate what they have on hand by the time the cops come in. So that means that this person has a supply of drugs that is not enormous. So even if they're a dealer, they're like a street level dealer. They're not like they're not runner. They're not like, they're not a mule, unless they're like a really small volume mule or anything like that. So you're talking about busting at best at best street level dealers.
Hmm.
Um, and so, really, you think that it's a good use and risk of people's lives, not just and I'm not talking about the people who are potentially, you know, have the drugs, whether you agree with that or not, whether they have it or not, and whether you know they've been proven to have it or be doing things illegal or not. Even putting that aside, you think it's a good use and risk of those law enforcement officers' lives to do such a thing, knowing that if it is a drug dealer, that it's a high likelihood they have a gun for their own personal protection, and not from cops necessarily, but other dealers, you know, competition, gangs, because often there's a high prevalence of gang involvement when it comes to drug dealing. It's like the risk factors here are off the charts, just so that you can get a drug bust. That makes very little sense to me. Number one, even doing those kinds of busts are extremely high risk anyway under any kind of circumstances. And then why would you want to do something that just, from my perspective, exponentially increases the risk that something bad's going to happen? That just seems like poor law enforcement, regardless if the courts allow it, if the law allows it. It just seems like a poor technical approach to law enforcement, personally. I don't know. What do you think about that, Doyle?
You know, I think anytime I think about this kind of topic where one will think in terms of the why behind it,
Yeah.
and in a greater sense, right? I mean, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about that one particular potential or perceived perpetrator of sorts and the risk to others or whatever, but we're talking about sort of in general
Yeah.
the why behind it. I don't think we can escape the fact that it's to make somebody's job a little easier, right?
Sure.
Because in reality, to your point about why would law enforcement do that, their as principled as I have no qualms at all with police. I think most police officers and leaders and management are good-hearted people. They have good intentions, but just like anyone else, they're human first. Right. And so they're going to want to do things that make their lives easier, their jobs easier, make them more successful, and not necessarily in a personal aggrandizement kind of way, but in a professional way. They want to be
Well,
successful. They want to accomplish the goals of their profession.
it's part, and at some point I want us to get to a real meaty discussion about this topic in particular. But it's just about the incentive structure. What are
Sure.
the incentives that they're operating by, and uh, how does this either increase incentives or make or decrease incentives, right, in certain ways that causes behavior one direction or another? And it's just
Sure.
it creates incentives for, I will say it, sloppy police work, just period. That's my
Sure.
opinion on it.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think that's fair. But my point was that that is the result. That is the outcome.
Yeah.
But it starts from a good intention spot, and that's a phrase we've used a couple of
I'm about to
times.
say this is a recurring theme.
Right.
It's path to
And I think
somewhere.
it is. I mean, I think you and I both, on numerous occasions, have expressed uh, uh, an optimism about the goodness in people, right?
Sure.
And there are those that have that don't have that natural goodness, right? There are those that are evil. Let's just be real. But by and large, we're talking about not the evil, because the answer there is much clearer. Right, you fight evil in the way it needs to be fought, head on. With I won't say annihilation, but that sounds kind of harsh. But with at least containment of that evil. And whereas on the other side, it's harder to fight or to address in a way that is constructive, right? Because it's so easy to immediately go to the result is um, uh, you know less than optimal, or it's flawed, right?
Yeah.
Because of it went past or beyond the pale of acceptability or
Sure.
to natural law, as you've used before. It's there's a natural law that's something is right or it's not, and or it's good or it's not, and it's not a matter of, well, it's right for you, but it's not right for me, that kind
Right.
of thing. There's this just absoluteness about it, I believe, and I think with the police, they get so they can get immune to, well, their goal is admirable, to get the bad guys, that the method and the means to get there, well, it's okay to skirt the lines and go over the lines a little bit, as long as you're getting to the result. But
And
they're
the problem
becoming
is it's not even any means necessary though, right? It's one thing if you want to set up that situation and argue for any means necessary, but that's not even what we have here. We have any means expedient, and that's the
right.
worst possible situation.
Sure, because then it removes the motivation or the incentive, as you said earlier. It removes the incentive to want to ensure you do it the absolute correct way, because it
Right,
takes more
right, right.
and that's something that the most of us want to do things as expediently and as quickly as we can, uh, but we also want to do it right, whatever it is.
Right.
And I think holding the police to that account is okay, but when there's the 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 all the branches, the law enforcement, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, which be the law enforcement, the judge, and the prosecution, or the lawmakers, when they're all uh, in cahoots, so to speak, when they're all seeing the picture in the same way, then you get some groupthink going on. Well,
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
that's just, we've got to do that. We have no choice but do that, which is no knock warrant should be. You have no choice, right? And it's obvious by just a few facts that we've discussed here tonight, that it's gone from 3,000 recorded no knock warrant raids in 1981 to 50,000 in 2005, and who knows how many there are now.
So
In the
the,
last
the
20 years.
a couple things I want to talk about real quick, rapid fire, because you hit a lot of things that
Right.
triggered thoughts in my mind. First, you're talking about fighting evil. The only way to fight evil is to neuter it. You can't fight it head on the way that you were kind of describing. You can,
Right.
excuse me, you can fight it head on, but that's in the long run. That's going to be more pain, more suffering for everybody involved. What you have to do is you have to disempower the evil. Two, talking about. Everybody tries to do, things the most expedient way possible. But the problem is, everybody, and most especially the people who are law enforcement, should treat their role as much, much, much more sensitive in the things that they do than the average person. And if they don't, then they're disrespecting the level of power that they've been, that's been put on them, right? And if that's also the case, then everybody, and to my degree, not myself included in this number, everybody who's extremely skeptical of the police has been given even more reason to be so. And let me be clear though, my skepticism with the police, and this is a real aside, I just want to clarify this because I've never really talked about this before. My skepticism with the police is skepticism with the power structure, not with the people who are police. I personally know several people that are police officers, some of the greatest people I know, and I know their intention is pure, but that doesn't mean that in the heat of the moment they're going to make a snap decision that is the wrong decision, not just by an accident, but just because of groupthink, like you're saying. They're there all the time. They can't help but absorb this way of thinking, or that they've been taught something that really is not right, and we just don't have line of sight that they're being taught some things that are just not right. So like I said, my skepticism is with the power structure, and not and not in the sense that there is a power structure. It's not it at all, right? I'm not some radical anti-hierarchy sort of person. I think that there's good cause for hierarchy in certain times, and I think they should be voluntary, all of them. But being having that sort of power differential in a police officer versus the normal citizen, they must take infinitely more care about the things that they do with their position than the regular person does, because of what impact they can cause. So that's my say for that. The third thing that I wanted to say is, you're talking about and it's also off that same point about doing the things that are most expedient as possible. Well, it's harder for people to see that with law enforcement because it's like small scale, like one person, two person. But it's easy if you say, well, what about war, right? We wouldn't do something akin to a no-knock warrant in war ever. I mean, we get close to it with like non-declared wars and things like that, but I mean, we wouldn't. Uh, there's always except for like CIA like black ops and wet ops and stuff like that. If you take that out, we basically always have at a bare minimum a lot of saber rattling before we do any kind of military action, right? Even if it's not Congress sanctioned war, no matter what it is. So there's at least that. That's more than that's happening here with these no-knock warrants, right? And it's really ridiculous. And everybody would see the despicableness of just dropping into a country saying America F yeah and firing guns at somebody, right? Everybody knows that's completely wrong. This is exactly what's happening here. Basically, somebody's having their private home environment. You can say that, yeah, they're a criminal and they this, that, and the other. It doesn't matter. The law says they are not. The law says they are not. So somebody who is not a criminal at home in a private location is being like, somebody's rappelling in off a helicopter. I mean, that's not literally what they're doing. I'm saying this for effect, but it's like they're rappelling in off a helicopter, coming in, Santa Claus style through the chimney and saying, "What up?" firing the gun. It's again, that's for dramatic effect, but it's the same principle. Somebody's coming into your private space. What do you think you're going to do, right? And somebody does that to me, you're going to be prepared for that. That's all I'm going to say. And we have legal ways of being prepared in this country that have fatal and sad consequences if that is done in mistake or poorly.
Sure.
Anyway.
And I think we would agree that's one of the tragic results, unintended and tragic results, right? We actually mentioned some of the statistics where the number of people, bystanders, that have been killed and have died as a result of these no-knock warrants. They were supposedly innocent by being called a bystander and not a perpetrator or a suspect. So they were innocent bystanders that the consequences were they lost their lives. Even if everything else had been okay and acceptable, that is an unacceptable outcome, which in the current situation with the coronavirus pandemic that we're dealing with sort of raises the question that has come up many times there, and I won't chase that point, but it's how many deaths are okay for this to happen, and for the outcomes, which I think we started this off with what are the typical circumstances, and so you end up talking very likely it's a drug case, right. And so how many lives are not to say that the law enforcement shouldn't attempt to get the drug offender, whether they're a dealer or whatever, not that they shouldn't be dealt with according to the law as they're written, but do it in a way that doesn't cause undue risk to them as well. I mean, them and the police, the suspect and the police, as well as anybody innocent bystanding in that particular situation, which I think in recent months there have been cases where that's happened, or situations where that's happened.
Sure.
and I don't think anyone would disagree that that's tragic, and should cause everybody to pause and take a step back and think, right? And the sad part, another sad part of this whole topic and whole situation, is that the people of this country, of the United States, really have no say in this. This is a point and a topic that have no direct say day to day. This is something that came up through case law, and this is through judges who have, through one method or means or mechanism or another, made it a human interpretation. Now, granted, they're supposed to be well reasoned and well founded and based on good foundational legal principles, based on the number one by the Constitution and then the statutes of the jurisdiction. and but then on just common sense principles as well. And I think sometimes that's the part that's missing most, and that's common sense.
Well, I mean, we've even talked on this podcast in earlier episodes about judges who use their bench as a throne from which they issue, activist causes, and
Sure.
rulings for activist causes, and it's like that's wrong. And what can we do about it?
Right.
You can say, oh yeah, you have a voice to if it's a judge that got voted in, you can vote them out, and it's like, well, that's too late. They've already, done that, and it's like, what if I didn't vote for them in the first place? And I'm still subjected to that. So what are you saying? You're saying that other people have any kind of dominion over my rights? That's literally what you're saying.
Sure.
And
Yep.
it's like,
Absolutely.
that's kind of messed up. I mean, it's not kind of messed up. It's very messed up.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, again, that would take us down another road if we were to talk about that. One thing, though, I want to mention before we talk about some of these cases more specifically, some of the recent ones, is that all of this bloodshed and potential bloodshed with the risks that are being, undertaken in such cavalier approach to, executing warrants, is that you're want to trade all this or risk all this for a drug dealer? Like, I understand if you really hate drugs and you think they're an abomination on earth, that's fine. Do you think human death is worse than drugs? Or drugs being there worse than human death? Right? If you really believe that drugs are terrible and abomination and we need to do everything to stop it, that's fine. How many people are you willing to have die for that? Right? How many innocent people are you willing to have die for that? How many law enforcement officers are you willing to have die for that? Right? And if that answer is more than 0, their blood is on your hands. Their blood is on your hands. That's all I can say about it.
Yeah, a valid point, and very timely point as well. Quite frankly, I've heard that phrase, very similar use of that phrase out of this context into a different context, used in the same way. Um, and I think this particular one is one that is sort of riding below the radar to a certain extent, right? I don't think
Yeah.
the general public knows. Quite honestly, until I began to research this a little bit, I didn't know how recent these no-knock warrants were. Of course, I'd seen them on some of the cop shows, and I thought that they had been around for a long time. I thought that was just sort of a special, rare case situation that came up. And what I have found out is it's not as rare as I thought it was, and it's not as special a case. In fact, it's a pretty unspecial case, if that's a way to phrase it. Pretty ordinary case, right?
Well,
And primarily it's drugs, right?
it's common
Or at least
enough. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, that's fine.
It's
Go ahead.
common enough that there are a large amount of well-documented cases where the no-knock warrant was served on the wrong address.
Absolutely.
I'm not talking about 1. I'm not talking about 2. I'm not talking about 10. A large amount of well-documented cases, not just primary documentation from the police officers. I mean, accounts like secondhand, thirdhand, not thirdhand, first-person accounts, people in it, and second-person accounts, people seeing it on news, in the local newspapers. You can look this stuff up, and it's just ridiculous that, one that I had thought of recently, and this is going to sound anecdotal because I don't have the names of the locations, but I had watched an interview that was on the local news about it, and the guy who they'd raided effectively, the street number was not even the same. It was the same street, but it was like 2 houses down or something, and they had told them that the house was brick and there was a white car there. That's all they went on to go and just, tally ho into this person's house with guns drawn on this dude who had 4 kids.
Yep.
4 kids. What if a kid had run out there and they just shot the kid, or whatever, or the guy was a gun owner, right? And he said he came around the corner and saw them all coming in with guns, and he turned around and dropped his gun or whatever it was that because he's like, I'm not dying today, and then my kids aren't going to die today, that sort of thing. And he didn't realize they were police until they got real close to him because, shining lights and stuff. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
wait a second. He didn't even know they were police? That's ridiculous. So it's like, and it's a completely wrong house. It could have ended in a bloodbath. Thank goodness nobody got hurt. They messed up his door, right? Because they just like straight up kicked it in. I don't know. That's just frustrating to think about, but not as frustrating as some of these cases we will talk about. So, do you want to talk specifically about some?
Well, yeah, you had mentioned to me, and I had so for some reason missed the first one, the case of Duncan Lemp. It was over in North Carolina or South Carolina, over on the eastern coast somewhere.
Yeah.
Can't remember exactly the state it was from, where this individual was
Maryland.
Maryland. Okay, so I knew it was on the eastern seaboard. And that he was, the police executed a no-knock warrant, and if I'm correct, it was based on one person's word that he might have something amiss.
Well,
And
we don't even know. It was an anonymous tip, so
okay,
for all we know, it could have been a generated recording.
right.
I mean, that's an extreme thing, but the point remains that there was no verification of who gave the tip.
Right. And if memory serves me correctly, he was a legal gun owner. He was had his license to own his gun that he had. And when the police came in unannounced, he did what any armed or any gun owner would do if they felt put upon. He reacted. And the end state of that was he was killed. And it come to find out that there was I think there were no drugs or no anything that he was purported to have had there. And to use the phrase, he was probably squeaky clean, with one exception. And that was he had a strong philosophical and political lean that some think that might have been at least some part of the cause of the angst and the problem toward him.
There's one other thing that while I you can have whatever opinions you want on this, but as far as I understand it, there's one other thing that could be held against him, and that's again, though it's his private property, so whatever you think about this, you think he had a booby trap set up, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, right.
So that is illegal under the letter of the law to have your own house even booby trapped. For this precise reason, if cops have to come in and they get injured or whatever, that's the only reason that's illegal. But it's hard to look at what happened and take that as a bad, or the word illegal becomes real funny here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like he had really good reason to have that booby trap then, right? Clearly.
Apparently,
right?
yeah.
So I have no problems with. Personally, I have no problems with the idea of people booby trapping their own house. I think it's silly because what's going to happen? Stuff like this, it's just going to happen. So
right. So you can't set a booby trap to protect against some invasion by authorities.
No, but from anybody. Like, so you can even if your reason is for like thieves or whatever, you can't do that because authorities might have to come in and they may set off the trap.
But that's my point. That's the reason. The ultimate reason is, as you alluded to early on, is so that the authorities would be protected if they had to come in.
Right.
Right. I mean, because by and large, most people, most common day folk, so to speak, if they heard of if someone had a booby trap set up to protect their home, and someone really tried to break in, some with illegal intentions, to steal or to rob or hurt or maim.
Well, at that point, it doesn't matter what their intentions are. They've already committed an illegal act by breaking and entering.
Right, but
two illegal acts, actually.
Some people will, they were just trying to get some food. So, it's one thing, or they were just trying to, he's a druggie and was getting a TV to go sell it or something, versus the hard thing, come in and we've known of the cases where, children have been kidnapped,
right.
Trying to protect. I mean, people go, yeah, if you can protect your children, to whatever extent, and most people would protect them to whatever extent. But my point being that most people wouldn't have a bad taste in their mouth if something like that were to happen, and the criminal were the one that were injured.
Right.
Yeah, that's sort of my point, and that it takes on a different a tenor if it's a law enforcement official, whether they're doing something that's legal or uh, authorized. And I use those terms intentionally,
Well,
right?
that's why I
Legal versus
said legal
authorized.
becomes really funny, right? I mean,
Right.
because I mean, there at some point you have to make a distinction. And I think I was speaking with my wife about this or somebody recently. It may have even been you, but I don't know. You have to remind me if it was you. That there's a difference between something being a statute and
Oh yeah.
in code, and then something being legal, right?
Right.
Because you can put something in code that tries to violate a natural law, like literal, outright natural law. You can say that's the law all day. You're wrong. I'm sorry, you're just wrong.
Right.
That's why I think that so much of the law of the United States is just ridiculous, like literally ridiculous, worthy of ridicule, because it purports to be the law when it just in of itself on its face violates any real natural law that anybody should want to accept because it's for their own freedom.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. We had that conversation, a few days ago, and I agree with it. Right. I mean, we have been so conditioned to think of the statutes of various governmental jurisdictions, regardless, even if they're a municipal code or the state code or the federal code, we've been conditioned to believe and understand and define and use the terms that, well, if it's in those statutes, in those codes, then it's legal, right? Which your point is, no, that just makes it enforceable by
Right.
the law enforcement agencies,
Yep.
not necessarily purely whether it's legal or not, because there's a greater law that determines what's legal. And as a Christian and a believer, there's a phrase that I've heard used before, and it says, God said it, I believe it, so that settles it. But no, the reality is God said it, that settles it. It doesn't matter whether I believe it or not. And so I think the whole thing about legal is it doesn't matter what I think about it or say about it or what a judge or anyone, if it's legal, if it follows the natural law, then it's legal. If it violates the natural law, as you said earlier, then it's illegal.
And here's the thing that I think is an interesting intersection. You bring up about being a believer in God, and I think that regardless of that, you can understand that there's a law beyond human law, right? That's pretty clear, right? Even in nature with physics, and when I say natural law, I don't mean necessarily within the confines of physical nature, right? I mean all of nature and reality.
Mm-hmm.
But even within the confines of physical nature, I mean, you look at law of gravity and things like that. It's like that's true, right? There's a truth about that's when we know that that's true anywhere in the universe. Gravity is exerting anywhere in the universe. That's part of
Mm-hmm.
the law. And so it's the same way with when I say the natural law. That's what I mean. And I think the interesting intersection here, like I said, you can I think no, I don't think that is true regardless of what you want to think or believe about it. And I'm not talking about God or anything. I'm talking about natural law. But the
Right.
interesting intersection that I want to bring up here is for people who do believe in God. I would encourage you to think and do some research on the language of not just the Bible, but all holy books that are ancient, and think about things how either even parts of the Bible where God's referred to as the law. You have Jesus as the Word and God is the law. And that means something. And there's something beyond just those words being used. Because when you're a kid and you hear that just sounds funny, or like it doesn't mean anything to
Sure.
me. But there's way deeper meaning there than just, oh, it's coincidental that God is the law or issued the law, makes the law or whatever, and us calling God the law. It's like, no. Personally, my belief is that those two things are literally the same thing, and
Sure.
they're inseparable.
It actually, when with that uh, uh, concept, that idea that principle, it certainly strengthens a lot of the other things that come out of a spiritual and godly belief, right?
Sure.
The it doesn't matter what Caesar says, right? I mean, it's kind of like
Exactly.
when Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, but
Yeah.
render unto God that which is God's," and I think that's another word example. Literally using Jesus as the word to demonstrate that, and that's pretty compelling. I had never, I mean, I've heard that all my life, and I'm at least 39 years old. I've heard that term about God as the law and Jesus as the word, not together, but in different times. But when you pull it together, it does tie the the totality more clearly together.
And the law, and I don't want this to become like a real esoteric podcast right now, but I want to go one more step into this because if we're here,
Sure.
this is interesting to take the next step. The next step is that um, since if we since we're thinking about God as the law and Jesus as the Word, the law transcends human ability to understand and to speak, and the Word allows humans to speak the law. So we can come and we can say the word of God here in this place, and that's how we begin the process of bringing heaven onto earth, is by speaking the law of God here on this planet in this place. Anyway,
That's cool. That's cool. No, I'm with you. That's pretty compelling. Pretty compelling.
so anyway, back to the topic at hand, and a little more, much more grave and sober,
Somber.
sober and somber, is this Duncan Lemp situation. It's just sad because like he was at home with, I think his mom was there, and then like his girlfriend who was pregnant with his child, and it's like, oh my goodness, how, and he. At least only one person died in all of this situation. That is the
Mhm.
only redeeming. It's not redeeming. The only thing to save it from being a unending travesty. I mean, it's a travesty. Don't get me wrong. It's hard to make gradations there, right? But
Understood. Yeah.
it could all of them. The police officers or law enforcement officers also could have ended up dead because everybody had guns, that sort of thing. So you just never know what could happen. I think what the deal was, that the reason why it wasn't any worse than it was that they threw flashbangs in, and so of course that disorients so many people, and that's why they were able to take him down. But as far as I understand it, one of the flashbangs almost hit the girlfriend,
Mm.
and if that thing had hit and exploded on her, who knows what that would have done? Maybe
Sure.
could have really injured the baby, could have seriously injured her, clearly. Dude, that's just bad.
So that sort of makes you wonder. Not wonder. Maybe wonder is not strong enough a word. It makes me worry. Um, could that happen to me? Could that happen to
Sure.
you? And because notwithstanding, the what I mentioned earlier about his views, his political views, and things, notwithstanding, not that that would justify, no matter if one was on the left or on the right, does not justify it, but it was unfounded, obviously, or at least it appears, or that everything about that was totally unfounded.
Yeah.
Um, and could that happen to someone else? Someone else get angry at you for whatever reason, and make an anonymous tip to the police and say, hey, I saw it, and I'm afraid for my life, and
Right.
that's the reason I'm doing this anonymously. So and then the police take it seriously, right? Maybe there's some other rationale, even if there's not, but if that's all there is, and then they take this kind of action for innocent people. That would be. I'm hoping that this situation is one that will cause um, the overseers to pause and think more thoroughly through these snap decisions, right? About because one of the examples that I mentioned earlier, um, uh, on a no-knock warrant. It was, I didn't mention it yet. I think it was one down in Colorado or whatever. The warrant was a no-knock warrant that was executed at 2:23 a.m. Right. Most people, not all these days, but most people, that's normal sleep time. So they're very, you know, they're out and they're not. I mean, they're
Yeah,
asleep. They're not active. So by virtue of that, the whole no-knock warrant becomes moot. It's not necessary because there's not imminent risk of the destruction of evidence or anything like that, which still seems very uh, uh, insufficient as a reason.
sure. The Duncan Lemp thing was at 4:30 a.m.
4:30 a.m.
Yeah,
Right, and there was another one that I had seen in my notes, and right now I can't. Oh, this was one in Georgia. The deputy got a no-knock warrant, waking a county magistrate at night, and made inaccurate sworn statements. And then it was a pre-dawn at 2:25 a.m. I missed it by a couple of minutes.
that
The
is
SWAT
ridiculous.
team, the SWAT team ran through and exploded in a 19-month-old child's playpen. It didn't kill him, but he had terrible injuries. You know, internal and external, by false information that a deputy presented to a magistrate in the middle of the night. So, first of all, a magistrate, no one is going to be awakened in the middle of the night and be of the best frame of mind to make that kind of a serious decision,
Right.
right? Even the Supreme Court doesn't make decisions like that, right? And they're the quote unquote allegedly, supposedly the most qualified to make far-reaching decisions of that sort. So, you end up having people that are accustomed to much, traffic offenses or minor, personal, batteries and things of that sort, and theft and shoplifting, and making these kinds of life and death decisions, in the middle of the night. And I mean, so that's
Well, and then the real bad part about the Duncan Lemp situation is that warrant was issued on the basis, and I think we haven't mentioned this yet, was issued on the basis of a single anonymous tip that came in 3 months earlier.
yeah.
That is it. And so the warrant was for confiscation of illegally possessed firearms. Okay, so let's go through this. One anonymous tip, they don't know who said it, basically said this dude's got guns he shouldn't have. All right? Let's just say, yeah, let's get a warrant for that and let's go get those guns. Why does it have to be no knock? Oh, he's got guns. Okay, well, you know that he doesn't live there alone. This was known knowledge that his I think his mother lived there, and then his girlfriend who happened to be pregnant. Why wouldn't you just stake out the house, wait till he leaves, and then serve the warrant, knock, and serve it? Like, why do you want to do this while he's there, while he's asleep, and knowing that you're going into a situation where there's guns? Because that's the whole point here. It's the whole claim. That is some of the dumbest decision making I've ever heard of in my life. Coming from not only the people issuing the warrant, or the judge issuing the warrant, but specifically the people executing the warrant that was issued. It's like, at least if the warrant was issued, okay, do it in a sane way. But what? Why? It makes no sense. Nobody's explained why. Nobody's explained why the warrant was even issued, because what kind of shaky evidence is one anonymous person's claim?
Sure. Well, here's the sad part. Unless a different agency comes in to investigate it, and I trust that they have, the FBI or some other agency, to do an independent investigation, they may not get the truth out. And of course, the constitutional rights apply to these police officers, so many of them will probably invoke their constitutional rights against self-incrimination, and I wouldn't expect them to do otherwise. But the saddest part about that is that then there's the other side of the situation with the civil claims that certainly this person, Duncan Lemp's unborn child, and his girlfriend and his mother would have a claim for, what's it called,
Wrongful death.
wrongful death. Thank you, a
Yeah.
wrongful death, and they won't be able to get the facts, and so the facts will not be available. Not readily available, and one can just hope and trust that somewhere the accountability will be brought forth in such that at least sufficient amounts of facts and truth will come out to have a clearer picture of it. But it may be a long time.
I'm not as optimistic as you are, and here's why. There's some additional facts that I want to talk about, and you may have read about this. I'm not sure, but so the police have not released. There's body cam footage,
Mm-hmm.
but they've not released it. And this has been what, 3 months now, something like that.
Right.
And they have not released, still have not released it. Haven't said why. They had a press release talking about they're going through internal investigation, whatever, this, that, and the other. Okay, sure, and that may take a while. That's fine. But one of the local papers, I think it was, submitted a set of questions, and all of the questions were not related to this case at all. So what they said was, "What is your police department?" And something like, "What's your police department's policy on releasing body cam footage on cases that are undergoing internal investigation?" They didn't say what case. They said, "What's your policy? What's your precinct's policy? And what's your policy about this? What's your policy about that?" So it was like wanting to know what they can expect, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the response from the police, the PR response was, "We've already made a public statement about this case. We have nothing further to add to it. We'll update you when there's more to add." And it's like, what case? The questions weren't about a case. The questions were about your precinct policy. And so that was intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they said what their policy was, it's probably, "We don't have a policy," which is
Right.
real bad, versus them having a policy and that they're violating. Not having a policy is almost worse than them having a policy that they're violating.
Right.
And so likely they don't have a policy. And thus they are caught in a really bad situation, and they're trying to figure out how to protect themselves. I understand that some measure of this has to be them protecting themselves, because if they're going to maintain their status as, policing the community, they have to do that. But the reality is, the truth cannot suffer because of that. That is vastly subordinate to the truth. And that's my skepticism and my lack of optimism here, is I don't believe that they're treating it that way because of that kind of a disingenuous response.
Well, but you're talking about, that's the internal investigation, not a. Was it the FBI that made that statement, or is it
No, the local
agencies?
mhm. The local paper asked the local agency, "What's your policy on this?" And
Right.
they construed it as them asking about the Duncan Lemp case.
Well, and rightfully, not rightfully so, understandably so. They're trying to deflect, right? They're trying
Sure,
to deflect.
not acceptably so though.
No, not acceptably at all. Just this
Right.
reason I said,
I just
even
want to
start off
clarify.
rightfully. Yeah,
Yeah.
start saying rightfully. I meant understandably so.
Right.
Just out of human nature.
Sure.
My optimism isn't about that. My optimism is about having an external independent agency. Right. And I use the term independent loosely, when I talk about, like, the State Bureau of Investigation or the Federal Bureau of Investigation coming in. I know locally here where I live, the State Bureau of Investigation always gets involved when there's a
Sure.
law enforcement officer involved shooting.
Yeah, that's
Right.
pretty common.
Yeah. And so even then, there's some cautious optimism that they'll get closer to the truth. But to your point, there's even then there's self-preservation, right? Because these police agencies tend to operate out of the same under a similar code of I don't hate to say ethics, but a similar code of behavior.
Well, I
Let's say.
mean, this is public knowledge. This is well known, and this is not even shrunk away from by those individuals and those organizations. Thin blue line, right? The Fraternal Order of Police. I mean, just look at the names of these things or the words that they use for these groups and these thoughts, and it's like, okay, I understand why you want to have those organizations and do those things, and I don't have any position against them on their face. But then when you have cases where it does not appear that we have really objective, and I'm not claiming that that's happening here, right? Because we just don't know, right? There's like a lot we don't know, and that's part of the problem, is we're talking without knowing all of what's going to be happening and is happening. But there are cases in the past with other situations where it's very clear that even higher up organizations protected, lower level agents of law enforcement.
Sure. It's the back scratch.
Exactly. And the thing is, again, it's because there's this huge power differential between the common person and even the lowest level law enforcement officer. And again, I don't say that to be derisive of them. I know the work that they do is difficult, and I'm not trying to say that it isn't. And I sure as heck wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't want to do it for many different reasons, not the least of which is because of I know how difficult that kind of work is. At least I know to some degree how difficult that kind of work is. And so I'm not trying to be, again, derisive or not trying to take pot shots or anything like that, but that huge power differential has to inherently bring about some skepticism, because I don't know you. You aren't me. And so I have to put trust in you. And so that means you have to do an extra big job of being worthy of that trust. Not just a regular job of being worthy of that trust, because you carry a gun. You can pull that gun and you can shoot me. And if you do that wrongfully, you got a whole structure here that may, I don't know that it will, it may not, it shouldn't, but it may come to your support in defense of you shooting me unlawfully, illegally, whatever, against code and statute.
Sure. So the Duncan Lemp case is a situation where he was the target of the no-knock warrant and was the victim, or at least was the outcome that suffered the outcome.
He was the victim.
He was. All of them were victims, but I mean, he was the one that paid the ultimate
sure.
Price in that outcome. But what about if it were a situation where it weren't him, but it was someone else, someone that was, an innocent bystander? We know that occurs because, the statistics that we alluded to earlier have implied that.
That's a sad segue to the other case that we were going to talk about, which is the Kenneth Walker and Breonna Taylor case. And this is what, in Texas? No, Kentucky. I don't know why I know I'm thinking Texas because there was another no-knock warrant thing that I was reading about that was down there. So this was in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, where the claim is that Kenneth Walker had drugs. I don't know if it was that he was running drugs or dealing drugs or whatever it was, but he had. I'm presuming that it was a dealer, because that's generally the only thing you're really going to get a warrant for. You're not going to get one for like simple possession or anything like that. But so let's say he was dealing, and that there was evidence that he was a dealer and probably had drugs. And so this is the classic scenario for that you would think, okay, yes, this is where they do a no-knock warrant, because like whatever it is, he just flush it down the toilet, burn it up, whatever. I mean, not burn it up. That's probably not going to work, but too much evidence left still. But yeah, so they're gonna do this no knock. They're gonna grab the contraband. They're gonna arrest him, take him away. Then wipe their hands, and they're done. So they do this. This is in an apartment building, mind you, which is
another layer of risk.
Yeah. Right, because those walls aren't stopping any kind of bullets, unless like maybe they're using hollow points, and even then, that's like paper you're shooting through.
Sure.
So anyway, they do this raid. I don't know what time of day this happened, but they do it and end up shooting and get in a shootout. and they end up killing his girlfriend Breonna Taylor, who happened to be there with him, and I think she was even firing at them. Legal gun owner, had her gun owned legally and was legally defending herself. The real rub here is twofold. The big one, I guess. Well, I don't know which one's bigger, but the one of them is that there were no drugs in the apartment at all whatsoever, and no evidence that he destroyed any or had any at all whatsoever. And then the other situation is that they did this warrant execution in plain clothes. What?
Right.
How is that even legal? One, or by code, by statute, and two, why would you think that that's a good idea? That was just another reason to give people to think that they're getting a home invasion. You scream you're police and you're in regular clothes. Heck, no, you're not a police officer coming into my house. I don't care what you say. I don't know you.
No one's flashing their badges, and that sort of defeats the whole purpose of.
Even if you had a badge, I wouldn't believe it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Barely believe a uniform.
The sad part is these events are occurring, have occurred, and are occurring more frequently. And we another principle of history repeats itself because people don't learn from history. I think this is some of what we're experiencing here, that they must know. The decision makers, the overseers and the arbiters and the executors of these no-knock warrants must know that the risks are so high and so terminal, so permanent. It's not like, oh, oopsie, I'm sorry. Here we made a mistake. Everything's okay. Go back to bed. It was the wrong house. Wrong information. We apologize. There's horrendous harm done. And certainly the worst harm done is the deaths, but I think a more permanent harm done is what it's doing to our society, and that is, to me, is the thing that is unsettling most to me when I think in terms of our culture and our society and our neighborhoods and our lives, is that the children that are being brought up in this, it's an entirely new normal on how and it's doing nothing to draw, and so many police departments are wanting to draw back to community policing, where the police are known and well known and respected and are looked at more as protectors of the community rather than attackers of the community. This doesn't help that at all. I don't think, not in one iota. There's no way that any police chief or sheriff or head law enforcement officer, whatever it might be, or even a judge for that matter, could make the case that these mistakes are okay because we're doing okay on the other side of things. Because I don't think that's the case. Not in making the police more viewed more as protectors of the community. Especially when you look at that, and I don't know this, so I'm not going to quote it as a fact, but there's probably a disproportionate occurrence of these in some neighborhoods over others. Let's just leave that topic there. And as far as,
well, I mean,
we know crime itself is that way. It's disproportionate in minority neighborhoods, and it's dealt with differently in minority neighborhoods.
Absolutely. I think, and here's the thing that I'll say, and this will probably be the last thing that I say about it tonight, because I don't want to go around on this too much, because like I want the understanding of how grave it is that Duncan Lemp and Breonna Taylor are dead. Innocent people who did not break laws were dead at police officers' hands for no good done. That's terrible. Terrible. Even if good were done out of it, it couldn't have been proportional good. The last thing that I'll say, though, about these cases is Duncan Lemp did nothing wrong. There was no law that he broke, and this warrant was issued for him based on an anonymous, potentially spurious claim. The police officers and the judge and everybody involved in that in Maryland should be ashamed of themselves and should immediately resign. I don't care if they didn't do anything illegal by statute or by code. You did things illegal by the code of humanity, and you don't deserve to continue being anywhere near law enforcement or the justice system. The same goes for the Kenneth Walker Breonna Taylor situation, and I won't say doubly so, but just as much, because Breonna Taylor did absolutely nothing wrong. Kenneth Taylor did nothing wrong, or Kenneth Walker did nothing wrong as far as we can tell, because the whole purpose of the warrant was moot, completely moot. There is shame and blood on the heads and hands of these people, and they should be. I hope that they have some sense of that, and then they can feel that, and they don't feel like it was just a mistake. It was definitely a mistake, but I hope that they understand that and will repent of the things that they have done, the evil that they have wrought in this world at their hands, maybe fully unintentionally, but they sure enough did it. And they need to realize that, and I hope that they do.
Well, there's nothing that I can add to that would make that any stronger or any more appropriate. I fully agree with you, and we're talking about principles of humanity, like you said.
Exactly, it's human life we're talking about here. And if you want to say that you protect human life and you value human life, and you don't. And you think that I'm wrong, I want to have a serious conversation with you why you think that I'm wrong, because I must be wildly off base or something if that's the case. Because to me, I see two people dead for no good reason.
Right. Yep.
And I don't know if it's going to happen again. Right? It could possibly happen again, and that's why I'm so upset by this.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing right now that will prevent it from happening again. Right. If behavior continues, results will continue.
Yeah.
And we have to speak the truth. We have to speak the truth as we see it and understand it, and get it out to more people. Because I think I'm embarrassed to say that I was not as informed on this topic as I am now, and I'm not nearly as informed as I need to be. And it's going to be something that I'm going to make a priority for me to be more aware of it, so that I can speak when necessary to maybe help in some fashion.
Or at least let other people understand. So many people just don't know. These kinds of stories get buried, and it's like you I'm not going to make this political right now, but they just get buried, and people need to know and understand these kind of things are not extremely rare.
Yes. Well, that's why sometimes you've just got to say stuff. Right?
Sure, absolutely.
Because, when you don't, you're complicit in a not a direct way, but in a way that doesn't do anything to stop it. And so I think that's why these discussions that we have, at least to me, are important, and I'm hoping that they're important to others in some fashion.
Yeah, I agree.
And that we can make a difference, and then we can make a difference by getting some of these topics out in front of others to hear.
Absolutely. Well, I guess
Jordan,
on that note, Doyle, yeah, we should probably call that the end.
Yeah, and we should, tonight say a special prayer for the folks that survived this, and even the perpetrators, right? Because as we said early on, we don't know that they're evil. Their hearts might be good.
Absolutely
But
not.
behavior is what we're talking about. The behavior and the results.
And when I say that they need to feel the shame, I want them to, because I want them to understand and be able to grow beyond this, and to help understand why these things are wrong, and to help end these bad things from happening. Because they're some of the ones that are in the best positions to be able to make those changes and help this world move forward.
Change starts with acknowledgement, and that's exactly what you're talking about. So, yep. All right, my friend, have a good night.
You too, sir.
Good talking with you again.
As always, we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye.